There was always going to come a moment in The Boys where Homelander stopped pretending. A moment where the performance finally collapsed completely. No cameras, no fake smiles, no carefully managed speeches about being a hero, just the real Homelander underneath everything. And honestly, Season 5, Episode 7 may have finally revealed that moment. Because what happened in this episode does not feel like another violent outburst anymore. It feels much bigger than that. It feels like the exact point where Homelander emotionally crossed a line he can never come back from. And the terrifying part is, I do not think the massacre itself is even the worst thing that happened here. The real horror may be what comes after. Because once you really break down the episode carefully, it becomes obvious that this massacre was not random rage. It was the collapse of the last illusion, keeping Homelander connected to humanity at all. And now, the entire world of The Boys may be entering its most dangerous phase yet. One of the greatest hidden details in the episode is how emotionally calm Homelander feels during parts of the massacre. That matters enormously. Earlier versions of Homelander usually exploded emotionally before committing horrific acts. He would rage, scream, lose control publicly. His violence often came from emotional instability bursting outward. But this episode feels different. The violence feels controlled, deliberate, almost emotionally detached. And honestly, that may be far more terrifying than Homelander simply snapping in anger. Because rage eventually burns itself out. Calm violence does not. The episode quietly suggests something horrifying about Homelander's psychological state now. He may no longer see ordinary human beings as emotionally real anymore. Not fully. Not as equals. Not even as individuals. They increasingly feel like obstacles, disappointments, or extensions of his own emotional frustrations. That is a completely different level of danger. Because once somebody stops emotionally recognizing humanity in other people, morality becomes almost impossible to recover. And honestly, I think the show has been building toward this psychological shift for a very long time. If you go back carefully, Homelander's relationship with humanity has been deteriorating season after season. Earlier on, he still desperately needed public love. Approval mattered to him emotionally because it helped stabilize his identity. He wanted people to worship him because, deep down, he still needed validation constantly. But now, something has changed. This version of Homelander increasingly feels like somebody realizing fear may be easier to control than love. And that realization changes everything. Because once Homelander stops needing emotional approval from the public, the last real leash controlling him disappears completely. That may actually be the hidden meaning behind the massacre itself. Not simply violence. Freedom. Homelander is finally acting without emotional restraint. And the fallout from that realization could become catastrophic moving forward. One of the most important reactions in the episode may actually be Ryan's. Whether the series openly says it or not, Ryan emotionally absorbs everything Homelander does. Every act of violence, every justification, every emotional breakdown. Ryan is still forming his understanding of power, morality, and identity through the example standing directly in front of him. That is terrifying. Because Homelander does not just destroy people physically anymore. He reproduces his worldview psychologically through Ryan. And honestly, episode the 7th of May quietly become the turning point where Ryan starts fully understanding what his father truly is underneath the performance. The really disturbing part is that Homelander probably believes the massacre was necessary emotionally. That is what makes him so dangerous now. He no longer sees himself as unstable. He sees himself as justified. In his mind, humanity constantly disappoints him, betrays him, judges him, fears him, and refuses to fully accept his superiority, which means every violent escalation feels emotionally rational to him. That psychological evolution is horrifying because it mirrors how authoritarian figures historically begin viewing violence as purification instead of cruelty. The enemy stops feeling human. Violence becomes framed as order. Fear becomes stability. And Homelander increasingly sounds like somebody moving toward exactly that mindset. Another major clue in the episode is how powerless everybody around Homelander feels now. Even characters who once believed they could manipulate or control him seem emotionally terrified in a completely different way. There is a growing realization spreading through the world of the boys that Homelander may no longer be governable at all. That realization matters enormously, because systems like Vought survive by maintaining the illusion of control. They always believed they could contain Homelander through media, branding, politics, or emotional manipulation. But Episode 7 quietly destroys that illusion completely. The monster outgrew the cage. And honestly, that may become the beginning of Vought's collapse itself. Because once corporations lose the ability to control the symbols they created, systems start destabilizing rapidly. Homelander was never supposed to become fully independent emotionally. He was supposed to remain marketable, predictable, controllable enough to serve the machine around him. But now, he increasingly feels bigger than the machine itself. And that is exactly why the massacre may change the future of the boys permanently. Because the story is no longer building towards simple political corruption or hidden conspiracies anymore. It is moving toward open societal collapse. One fascinating detail people may overlook is how the episode frames public fear afterward. Earlier seasons constantly focused on media manipulation, shaping public perception of Supes. But after this massacre, fear itself may become impossible to contain through propaganda anymore. And honestly, that could fundamentally reshape the relationship between humanity and Supes moving forward. Because for the first time, ordinary people may fully realize what happens when somebody like Homelander stops pretending to care about human morality at all. The illusion of superhero protection collapses instantly. And once that illusion dies, panic spreads fast. That may also explain why Butcher's role becomes increasingly important after Episode 7. Whether people agree with his methods or not, Butcher has always understood something most characters refuse to accept. Homelander was never going to stop, voluntarily. There was never going to be long-term peaceful coexistence. And now the rest of the world may finally be catching up to that realization too late. But here is where the theory becomes really disturbing. What if the massacre is not the climax of Homelander's story? What if it is only the beginning of his final transformation? Because psychologically, crossing moral lines repeatedly changes people permanently. Every act becomes easier after the previous one. Shame weakens. Empathy erodes. Violence normalizes internally. And Homelander increasingly feels like somebody emotionally evolving beyond ordinary human morality altogether. That may ultimately become the true horror of The Boys ending. Not simply a villain destroying society physically, but a godlike figure fully abandoning humanity psychologically. And honestly, Ryan may become the emotional center of that conflict. Because Ryan still represents uncertainty, possibility. The chance that power does not automatically destroy humanity completely. But after witnessing Homelander's massacre, Ryan may face the most important emotional choice in the entire series. Does he inherit his father's worldview or reject it completely? That question may ultimately determine the future of the Boys universe itself. Another hidden detail in Episode 7 is how isolated Homelander feels emotionally afterward. Ironically, the more powerful he becomes, the less human connection he seems capable of maintaining. Fear replaces intimacy. Obedience replaces love. And deep down, Homelander may actually understand this more than he admits. That makes his character strangely tragic despite everything horrific he does. Because underneath all the violence is still somebody emotionally broken long before he became powerful enough to destroy the world around him. A child raised without real affection, without identity, without normal humanity. And now that emotional emptiness is spreading outward across society itself. The system that created Homelander may finally be losing control of its own creation. And honestly, that may be the real meaning behind Episode 7's massacre. Not simply shock value. Not just another violent moment. The complete collapse of the illusion that Homelander can still exist inside normal human society peacefully. The Boys has always been a story about power without accountability. About systems creating monsters while believing they can control them afterward. But Episode the 7th may reveal the terrifying end result of that arrogance finally reaching its breaking point. Because now the world is facing something much worse than a corrupt superhero. It is facing somebody who may no longer emotionally recognize humanity as worth protecting at all. And honestly, That should terrify everyone moving into the final episodes.